cuts and a greater centralisation of power. Instead of creating a more effective, transparent, accountable democracy, the government wants to abolish the Seanad, cut the number of elected representatives in the Dáil and in local government, and centralise even more power and authority in its own hands. That's not real reform, Taoiseach. That is power grabbing. It may be a very democratic coup, but it's a coup nonetheless. More power for government, less accountability and democracy, and fewer checks and balances against political abuse and patronage. And the cuts agenda which dominates this government's thinking, as we have seen from the austerity policies, do not bring efficiency. They lead to hardship and inefficiency and more inequality. The Constitutional Convention, as you know, Taoiseach, has been considering the reform of aspects of the political system. Now, the government chose not to include the future of the Seanad in those considerations, and that's despite the commitment in the Labour Party pre-election manifesto, another broken promise to add to its growing list of broken pledges. I believe the Constitutional Convention could have played a very constructive role in reforming the political process. Instead, this was stymied by the government, which has significantly restricted the Convention's remit. The Convention, over the last 2 weekends, discussed the Dáil electoral systems, and I attended last week's deliberations. The citizen delegates were enthused, they were focused, but they were limited on what they could discuss. They could consider only the very narrow agenda of Dáil electoral reform, of electoral systems. So why didn't you trust the Constitutional Convention to discuss political reform? Why weren't they allowed to do this? Why were you afraid to allow these citizens to have their say on these matters? Were you afraid that they could advocate substantial reform of the Oireachtas, including the Seanad? It just makes so much sense to address the issue of how we do our business, how we govern ourselves, what's wrong from the citizens' point of view with these institutions, and to ventilate all the ideas of reforming the Dáil and the Seanad and local government. Instead, the government, which promised a democratic revolution and was claimed to be committed to the radical reform of an outdated system, has failed yet again. The approach to political reform has been piecemeal, minimalist, and all about reducing the number of elected representatives. It's been more about spin than substance. As well as getting rid of 60 Seanadúirí, you also plan to reduce the number of councils, of councillors, and of TDs. You've cut numbers but brought forward no real positive progressive change. You've done nothing to rebalance power between the central and local government. You've done nothing to rebalance power within the Oireachtas, between the executive and the legislature. And you risk missing an opportunity to create historical political reform and to leave behind a mess which another government in the future will have to clear up. Taoiseach, this state has one of the most centralised systems of government in Europe, based entirely on the British system. It has the weakest system of local governments, which have even been hollowed out further by successive governments. This concentrates too much power in the executive and the two houses of the Oireachtas, which are not fit for purpose in a 21st century Ireland. And the flaws evident in the Seanad are reflective of a broader malaise at the heart of our democracy and at the heart of this institution. The Seanad has not been reformed because successive governments refused to do so. On 12 successive occasions, reports have been produced proposing reform of the Seanad. Not one has been implemented. In 1979, the people voted in referendum to broaden the franchise to all graduates of institutions of higher education. That was never implemented. No government was prepared to allow further scrutiny of its work. As a consequence, today we have a government which is increasingly unaccountable, arrogant, and apparently oblivious of the impact its policies are inflicting on low and middle income households and on disadvantaged and vulnerable citizens. This is a government which is abusing its massive majority to force through legislation. The government's record on Dáil reform has been In the words of the Chief Whip, deplorable. More than half of the debates on bills introduced to the Dáil since the coalition came into power have been rushed through or guillotined. Remember the promise? The promise that this practice would only occur in the most exceptional circumstances? Up to mid-March, 52 out of 90 bills were guillotined. Rushed legislation invariably ends up with flaws, which will be challenged in the courts. Look at the legislation to provide for the family home tax. You rushed that through the Dáil before Christmas and had to come back in the new year to amend it. Another pledge on one of the major planks of your reform programme was that senior ministers would make themselves available to deal with topical issues. Instead, senior ministers have failed to appear in the Dáil 3 times out of 4 on average in response to these topical issues. In addition, the system of ordering Dáil business is not agreed through a system that is fair and inclusive and transparent of all the parties. The Friday sitting was presented as a means for the Dáil to pass more legislation and to be more efficient. It's failed on both counts. There are no votes, there are no questions to ministers. It's a farce. Taoiseach's questions, as I think you have acknowledged, have become a source of huge frustration for opposition parties. It serves no real purpose in its current format and is no way of holding the Taoiseach to account. The Houses of the Oireachtas Commission is not inclusive of all the parties to the Oireachtas, and its decisions frequently exclude Sinn Féin and others. There's no access to media facilities here for the opposition parties, unlike the government parties. If you want to do a press conference, opposition parties can choose between the plinth or, if the weather is inclement, huddling onto the portico. Now, how is that indicative of an efficient political system at work? The government also lauds its decision to allow Dáil committees to question newly appointed chairs of state boards. But these committees have no power to do anything about these appointments. Sinn Féin does believe that there is a case for a second chamber that is democratic, relevant and fit for purpose, and part of a wider political reform of the political system. And any reform of the Seanad must be underpinned by clear principles of democracy, accountability and efficiency in its role. Any reform has to be on the basis of universal franchise and direct election by the people. Sinn Féin rejects a Seanad whose members are hand-picked by county councillors, university graduates are nominated by a Taoiseach. Those who serve in any part of the Oireachtas should be elected by the people. A radical reform Seanad should also give a voice to citizens in the North. It should be a genuinely national institution. There's currently no provision for the participation of those citizens who live in the North to participate in the political life of this state. The Seanad should be elected by universal suffrage of the 32 counties of Ireland of citizens over the age of 16. And citizens in the 6 counties could and should cast their ballots by postal vote. The diaspora should also be represented. It's astonishing that a government that so regularly looks to the Irish diaspora to help with the economic crisis then denies these very same people the right to have a voice in the Oireachtas. Sinn Féin believes that it's possible to have a Seanad that's an elected forum for civic society, particularly for those sectors not adequately represented in the Dáil and from more marginalised sections of our community. This is the kind of real reform we should be debating. Look around this chamber. Mostly male, all white, mainly middle-aged, Catholic and heterosexual. A reformed Seanad should address this imbalance. There's no voice in the Dáil for ethnic minorities, whether they are Irish travellers or the myriad of other ethnic minorities who have come to this country in recent years. A reformed Seanad could change this. A reformed Seanad, a democratically elected Seanad, an accountable Seanad, could serve our democracy well and act as an important counterbalance to the political party-dominated Dáil. A reformed Seanad could, for example, further scrutinise domestic legislation, and in particular, European legislation. We've seen in recent years the results of the failure to properly implement or to interpret European legislation. Take, for example, the case of the Waterford Crystal workers, who took their fight for pension rates to the European Court of Justice due to the failure to properly, the system here, to properly implement the Insolvency Directive. Then there's the sugar beet industry, which was decimated by the closure of the Carlow and Mallow sugar plants that later emerged, which should never have been closed. A second chamber, elected in a different manner, with a less constituency-based or focused membership, would be better placed in the Dáil to discuss technical and complex policy issues at length, perhaps along the lines of the hearings on the X case. Taoiseach, you've spoken about comparisons with other EU states which function with just a single chamber. But in EU states with unicameral or single chamber systems, there are much stronger systems of local government. There's also a very clear separation of their executives from their legislator and sufficient checks and balances within the system to hold the executive to account. Now, this is clearly not the case in this state, and the government seems to have set its face against any real rebalancing of power between local and central government or between the legislator and the executive. When I hear the Taoiseach recently criticising the Seanad for failing to hold the excesses of the last Fianna Fáil government to account and to blame the Seanad for the economic crash, I was amazed. The reality, Taoiseach, is that you and your party were as much a cheerleader for the Celtic Tiger, for its excesses and lack of regulation, as the Fianna Fáil politicians who ran the state into the ground. Fine Gael Labour and Fianna Fáil were part of a cosy consensus in this state for decades. It was Sinn Féin during those years who argued for the wealth of the Celtic Tiger to be redistributed, to be invested in public services, in infrastructure and in sustainable jobs. It's the establishment parties that failed to act as a brake on the Celtic Tiger and to ensure that the economy was properly managed, invested, and that the corrupt activities of the golden circles were confronted and exposed. And that, Taoiseach, under your watch, continues. The cosy consensus is still there. To point the finger at the Seanad for the mess that all of you made of the situation would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. You collectively failed to legislate for the banks and the developers and the speculators, and then when it all went disastrously wrong, you still couldn't hold them accountable. And even now, you still won't hold them accountable, but choose to make ordinary citizens pay for the greed of the golden circles. And you seem intent on proceeding with a decision taken on a whim at a Fine Gael annual dinner without proper discussion here, analysis or scrutiny. So, Taoiseach, citizens should not be rushed into further curtailing the Oireachtas without looking at the consequences or without any serious consideration of the alternatives. A referendum should not be limited to abolition or retention. Why don't we give citizens the option of voting for root and branch reform? Would not be the decent thing? Would not be the democratic thing? Would not be part of what you promised in the election? Finally, one of the reasons offered up for the abolition of the Seanad is its costs. Now, Sinn Féin have consistently argued for the need to reduce high salaries in the public sector, including for politicians and ministers and their special advisers. So if you want to reduce costs in the Oireachtas, then cut these salaries. Cut ministerial, TD salaries, cut senatorial salaries, reduce allowances, cut the salaries of special advisers, and stop breaching your own pay caps for them. Taoiseach, you are proposing to reduce 2 dysfunctional chambers to 1 dysfunctional chamber without giving the people the option of voting for an alternative. Successive governments had the opportunity to reform the system. You all failed to do so. And now you're papering over the cracks and presenting this abolition bill as reform. It's not. Sinn Féin put forward a reasonable proposal that the Constitutional Convention should look at the reform of the Oireachtas. There's still the potential to do that. It could properly tease out all these issues with the aim of achieving the best checks and balances and the most democratic outcome for our system of government. So why rush Why not give people a number of choices? Why not put in place a reform package that is meaningful, sustainable, democratic and effective? Sinn Féin would support you in such an approach, but what we will not do is to support this amendment.